In the spring of 1963, the entire southern half of Adair County, Missouri, laughed at Nadine Pruitt. They laughed at the feed store in Kirksville when her neighbor Roy Detweiler came in and said she'd spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon planting black walnut seedlings in the back 40. They laughed at the co-op when the story reached Dale Fender, who ran the grain desk and had an opinion about everything, and who said that planting black walnut in a working pasture was the agricultural equivalent of burying money in a hole and waiting for it to grow. They laughed at the diner on the square when Nadine's brother-in-law, Gerald Pruitt, told the story over coffee and eggs and said she'd paid $60 for 200 barroot seedlings from a nursery in Colosse across a pasture that was already running 12 head of Angus without any trouble. They laughed at the church parking lot on Sunday when Gerald told it again, with additional detail about the spacing and the stakes and the wire cages she'd built around each one, as if she were raising something worth protecting. They laughed for 8 years. They stopped laughing in January of 1991 when an ice storm came down out of the north and held Adair County in its grip for 4 days and destroyed more standing timber than anyone could accurately measure. Lewis and Kansas City and Springfield, Nadine Pruitt's back 40 was the only timber in the county they actually wanted. Let me tell you about Nadine Pruitt, because what she did with that pasture only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she'd been taught to see when other people saw nothing worth looking at. Nadine was born in 1931 on the same 280-acre farm outside of Kirksville, where she would spend her entire life. Her father, Elwood Pruitt, was a soil conservationist by instinct and a farmer by inheritance. He had never attended a university. He had never taken a course in agronomy or forestry or land management. What he had done was read. He subscribed to every extension bulletin the University of Missouri published, and he kept them in a wooden crate under the workbench in the shop behind the house, organized by year, going back to 1924. He corresponded with a forester at the university named Harold Sievert, who had been writing about black walnut timber markets since the early 1952s, and Elwood kept those letters in a separate folder in the same crate. He had a habit which Nadine inherited completely of writing numbers in the margins of things: yield per acre, board feet per tree, years to maturity, price per 1,000 board feet in 1952. In 1955, Elwood Pruitt believed two things with the conviction of a man who had watched the 1,930 seconds take everything from his neighbors while leaving his own farm intact. He believed that debt was a mechanism by which other people controlled your decisions. And he believed that land produced value in more ways than a single cash crop could measure, and that the farmer who only saw one use for a piece of ground was leaving money in the soil every year. His workshop sat behind the farmhouse, a poured concrete structure with a tin roof and a wood stove in the corner that he'd salvaged from a schoolhouse in 1947. He had a post-hole digger that was older than Nadine. He had soil testing equipment he'd assembled from pieces over 20 years. He had a level transit he'd bought at a government surplus sale in 1951 for $4 that he used to map the drainage patterns on every field he owned. He used that transit to plan where water moved and where it stood, and where the ground was too wet for row crops in a wet year, and too dry in a dry one. He mapped his farm the way a general maps a battlefield, with attention to what the ground would and would not support. Nadine grew up in that workshop. She grew up reading the extension bulletins. She grew up understanding that her father's farm had survived the Depression not because of luck, but because Elwood Pruitt had no payments to make when the prices fell, no equipment loans, no operating notes. When corn went to nothing, and hogs went to nothing, and half the county was selling at whatever the bank would accept, Elwood Pruitt's costs were seed and fuel and his own labor. She had a suitcase packed in the spring of 1950. She had been accepted to a nursing program in Columbia, and she had a bus ticket dated the 14th of April. And she had told her parents she was going. Then her mother had a stroke in March of that year, and Nadine unpacked the suitcase and stayed. She never resented it. She said once, years later, that she had understood it as a trade. She gave up Columbia, and the farm gave her something Columbia couldn't have taught her. She was not sure, she said, that she'd gotten the worse end of it. Elwood died in the fall of 1961. He left Nadine the farm with no mortgage, a savings account in Kirksville with $14,200 in it, his workshop with everything in it, and the wooden crate of extension bulletins under the workbench. He also left her the folder of letters from Harold Sievert at the university. She read every one of them the week after the funeral. She read them the way her father had read them, with a pencil in her hand and numbers in the margins. Now, the Pasture, when Nadine looked at that back 40 in the winter of 1962, she didn't see what everyone else saw. What everyone else saw was 40 acres of decent pasture, running a manageable number of cattle, doing what pasture was supposed to do, earning what pasture earned. Roy Dentweiler, whose farm bordered hers to the east, would have told you that pasture was worth exactly what it produced in beef per acre per year, and that any use of it that interrupted that production was a loss. Dale Fender at the co-op would have agreed. Gerald Pruitt, who had married Nadine's brother Carl, and who considered himself the practical voice in the family, would have agreed loudly and at length. What Nadine saw was a 40-acre parcel with soil her father had mapped as Class T bottomland, with adequate moisture and good depth, running along a creek drainage that kept it from drying out in August. She saw ground that her father's letters from Harold Sievert had identified as nearly ideal for black walnut production. She saw 40 years of compound growth. She saw board feet accumulating in the soil while she continued farming the rest of the operation. And she saw a timber asset that would be worth more per acre at maturity than the Pasture had ever produced in its entire history. She had been planning it for more than a year before she placed the order. That's the part nobody in Adair County knew. By the time Nadine was laughed at in the spring of 1963, she had already been corresponding with the nursery in Columbia for 14 months. She had already sent soil samples from the back 40 to the University Extension Office and received the results back in November of 1961. 6 weeks after her father's funeral. She had already read every bulletin Elwood had kept on timber production and silvopasture and walnut markets. She had already written to Harold Sievert herself, and Sievert had written back twice, and his second letter included projected timber values per 1,000 board feet at 20-year, 30-year, and 40-year horizons based on current market trends. She had already decided before anyone knew there was a decision to make. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman acting on impulse, spending $60 on seedlings for a pasture that didn't need anything planted in it. They were actually watching the final step of a 14-month plan executed by a woman who had been taught by her father to think in decades. Let me tell you about the planting, because this is where Nadine proved that the difference between a buyer and a builder is not money. It is patience applied to a plan. She ordered 200 black walnut seedlings, bare root stock grade 1 from the nursery in Columbia in February of 1963, The order came to $60 even, including shipping. She had already staked the grid herself, using her father's transit to establish rows on 20-foot centers running northeast to southwest to minimize shading, with the rows spaced 30 feet apart to allow cattle to continue grazing. She had read that cattle would browse the seedlings if they were not protected. So she had spent the previous fall cutting Osage orange stakes from the hedgerow along the north field and splitting them into posts. Then she had bought a roll of woven wire fencing from the co-op in October, before anyone knew what it was for, and built individual cages around each staked position. 200 cages. She built them herself over 6 weekends in October and November of 1962, working after the fall chores were done, using her father's post-hole digger and a pair of fencing pliers he had owned since before the Second World War. The seedlings arrived in April. She planted all 200 in 4 days, working alone from first light until the light failed, healing in the stalk each evening to keep the roots from drying. She used a planting bar her father had made from a length of pipe and a welded steel foot, a tool she had watched him use for fence posts her entire childhood. The soil in the back 40 was exactly what the extension report had said: deep, dark, with good tilth and adequate organic matter from years of pasture sod. The seedlings went in at the right depth and the right angle, and with the roots spread the way the nursery instructions specified. Her total costs at the end of that first spring were as follows: 200 bare-root seedlings, $60. Woven wire fencing for the cages, $22. Osage orange stakes, no cost, cut from her own hedgerow, no cost, inherited from her father. Her labor, which she did not count because she had been taught that a farmer's own labor is not a cost but an investment. Total cash outlay, $82. Gerald Pruitt heard about the cages and the stakes and the planting bar and told the diner that Nadine had lost her mind entirely. Roy Dentweiler rode along the fence line on his tractor one afternoon in May and looked at the rows of small caged sticks across the back 40 and shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something he cannot explain. Dale Fender said at the co-op that he supposed she was entitled to do whatever she wanted with her own ground, but that he had never heard of anyone voluntarily reducing their carrying capacity to grow something that wouldn't be worth cutting for 30 years. 30 years. That was the number people kept using, as if it were a reductio ad absurdum, as if the mere mention of 30 years was sufficient proof that the idea was foolish. Nadine heard the number and did not correct it. She knew it was closer to 25 for the first commercial thinning and closer to 40 for the final harvest, and she knew that at current trajectory the timber values Harold Sievert had projected would look conservative. She did not say any of this. She went home and tended her cattle and her row crops and her garden, and she checked the walnut seedlings every week through the first summer, replacing the 4 that died with seedlings she had heeled in as spares along the creek bank. He had 196 living trees established in her back 40, growing in straight rows on 20-foot centers, each one caged and staked and rooted in some of the best bottomland soil in Adair County. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 28 years, because this is where the story stops being about black walnut trees and starts being about something else entirely. Nadine farmed. She ran her cattle operation and her row crops, and she kept her costs low and her books straight, not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, but because the ledger told her the truth, the comfort. She paid cash for everything she bought. When the tractor needed an engine overhaul in 1967, she did the work herself, in her father's shop, with her father's tools, ordering parts from a dealer in Kirksville and spending 3 weekends on the job or dollars, against a dealer's estimate of $900. When the grain bin needed new floor supports in 1971, she poured the concrete herself. When the well pump failed in 1974, she pulled it herself with a borrowed truck. She removed the individual cages from the walnut trees in 1966, when the trunks had reached a diameter sufficient to discourage browsing cattle. By that point, the trees were 8 to 12 feet tall, straight-boled with good form, exactly what the extension bulletins had described as the target at 3 years of age, in Class Tie bottomland. She continued grazing cattle between the rows. The Silva pasture system her father's bulletins had described was working precisely as described. The trees shaded the pasture in summer, reducing heat stress on the cattle. The cattle kept the understory clear, reducing competition for the trees. Roy Dentweiler, riding along the fence line in the summer of 1968, stopped his tractor and looked at the rows of young walnut trees for a long time. They were 15 feet tall by then. He took off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing. He did not ride along that fence line again for several years. Nadine was saving money. Not dramatically, not in any way that attracted attention, but steadily and without interruption. Her operating costs were lower than any comparable farm in the county because she owned her equipment outright and maintained it herself because she had no debt service and because her father had left her a farm that was already paid for. She was putting between $3,000 and $5,000 a year into a savings account in Kirksville and a second account in a bank in Macon, 25 miles away, because Elwood Pruitt had taught her that a woman with one bank account has one point of failure. By 1975, Nadine had $61,000 in savings. By 1979, she had $84,000. The walnut trees in the back 40 were 30 feet tall, and the best-formed ones had trunk diameters approaching 8 inches at breast height. She had done her first light thinning in 1978, removing the 40 least-formed trees from the planting and selling the logs to a mill in Macon for $1,100. She used the money to replace the roof on the equipment shed. She planted the thinning gaps with additional seedlings from a new order, maintaining her stocking density. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years, watch them laugh and shake their heads and say the thing they're doing will never amount to anything, and then watch the ground shift under everyone's feet at once, stick with me. Because this is where Adair County stopped laughing and started paying attention. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. You know what happened in January of 1991? If you were anywhere in the middle of the country that winter, you know what an ice storm looks like when it decides to stay. The system came in on the 10th and did not release the county until the 14th. 4 days of freezing rain and sleet that built ice accumulations of 2 to 3 inches on every horizontal surface, every branch, every wire, every fence post. The weight was extraordinary. Roads were impassable for 6 days after the storm broke. And the timber, the standing timber across Adair County and the counties north and south of it, came down in a destruction that people who witnessed it said looked like a bomb had been walked slowly across the landscape. The losses were categorical. Mature oaks split at the crotch under the ice load. Elm stands that had survived Dutch elm disease only to grow back as multi-stem clumps went down entirely. The the stems spreading apart under the weight until the root systems pulled out of the frozen ground. Hedge trees, which people had believed were indestructible, lost major limbs. Osage orange, which Elwood Pruitt had planted along his fence lines, specifically because it was supposed to be the hardest wood in North America, lost branches as thick as a man's thigh. Lewis and Kansas City and Springfield within 2 weeks of the storm. They drove the county roads in pickup trucks with clipboards, looking at the downed timber and the standing timber and making offers. Most of what they found was not worth their time. Storm-damaged oak was worth something, but not much. The elm was nearly worthless. The hedge was too hard to mill economically. The salvage market for ice storm timber in a county where most of the timber was mixed hardwood scrub was thin and disappointing, and the landowners, who had been counting on salvage revenue to offset their losses, found the offers insulting. Then a buyer named Warren Stiles from a veneer mill in St. Louis drove down the gravel road along the east side of Nadine Pruitt's farm on a Tuesday afternoon in late January and looked through the fence at the back 40. He stopped his truck. He got out. He stood at the fence for a long time. The walnut trees were 28 years old. They were 40 to 50 feet tall. They had been grown in open-grown conditions with adequate spacing, which meant they had developed the wide, clear boles that veneer buyers dream about. Long sections of straight, unbranched trunk below the first limb, the result of decades of good form and careful thinning. They had come through the ice storm better than almost anything else in the county, because black walnut wood is dense and strong, and the tree's architecture, with their high first branches and relatively narrow crowns, had shed ice load more efficiently than the wide-spreading oaks and elms. A few outer branches had come down, the trunks were intact, the form was intact, the value was intact. Warren Stiles knocked on Nadine's door that afternoon. She was 60 years old. She answered the door in her work clothes and listened to what he had to say. He told her he had been buying black walnut timber in Missouri for 22 years, and he had not seen a private planting of this quality outside of a university demonstration plot. He told her the form on her best trees was exceptional. He told her he wanted to buy the standing timber, or as much of it as she was willing to sell. Nadine said she appreciated him stopping. She said she wasn't ready to sell the whole stand, but she would consider a selective harvest of the most mature trees if the price was right. She said she'd need a few days to think about it. Warren Stiles said he understood and left his card. Roy Dentweiler heard about the visit from his wife, who had heard about it from someone at the feed store, and he drove over to Nadine's farm the next morning and stood at the fence line, looking at the back 40 for the second time. He stood there for a long time. He took his cap off and held it in both hands. He said finally that he owed her an apology. He said he had ridden along that fence line in 1963 and in 1968, and both times he had thought she was wrong, and he had been wrong, and he wanted her to know he understood that now. Nadine said she appreciated him saying so. She said her father had always liked Roy, and she thought Elwood would have been glad to hear it. She sold Warren Stiles a selective harvest of 62 trees that spring. The contract came to $38,400. The 62 trees she sold were the oldest and largest in the stand, the ones she had planted first and thinned around most carefully. She retained 112 trees in various stages of maturity, with the youngest cohort, seedlings she had planted in the thinning gaps in 1978. Now 13 years old and already showing the straight form and clear bole development that the older trees had demonstrated. The $38,400 went into the savings account in Kirksville. By the spring of 1991, Nadine had $127,000 in total savings between the two accounts. That summer, 240 acres of farmland adjoining her property to the north came up for sale. The family that had farmed it had been carrying operating debt since the mid-1980s, and the accumulated interest had finally overtaken them. They were not bad farmers. They had not made foolish decisions by the standards of the time. They had borrowed money when money was easy, and land was rising, and the extension service was telling everyone to get big or get out. And then the rates had gone to 18%, and the land values had fallen, and the corn prices had followed. And by 1991, they owed more than the farm could produce and more than they could refinance. And they had no choice but to sell. The listing price was $148,000. Nadine drove to the auction in July of 1991 in her father's truck, which she had maintained herself since 1961 and which had 214,000 miles on it, and ran without complaint. There were land speculators from Kansas City in the front rows. There was a farm management company from Des Moines with a representative who had driven down specifically for this sale. There were two neighboring farmers who had survived the 1,980 seconds and were looking to expand. The bidding opened at $90,000 and moved in $5,000 increments. The farm management company stayed until $131,000. The two neighboring farmers, both of whom were financing their bids, dropped out at $134,000 and $137,000. No one else bid. She walked to the front of the room and wrote a check. Not a bank draft, not a financing commitment, a personal check drawn on the account in Kirksville, covering the full purchase price $1,780. The room went quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a concluded auction, the other kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously recalibrates something they thought they understood. Several people looked at each other. The auctioneer held the check for a moment before he said anything. Gerald Pruitt was in that room. He had come to watch, the way people come to watch an auction, when they know the land and know the neighbors. He was standing near the back wall when Nadine walked back past him with her copy of the purchase agreement. He said her name. She stopped. He said that Elwood would have been proud of her. He said it quietly, without any of the performance that had characterized his opinions at the diner 30 years earlier. Nadine said she thought her father would have considered it a reasonable price per acre for good ground with access to the creek drainage. She said it without irony. She meant it exactly as she said it. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Elwood Pruitt would have understood without a word of explanation. Nadine farmed the expanded operation for 11 more years. She ran cattle on the new ground and rotated it into row crops and extended her silvopasture system into 2 additional parcels of the new acreage, planting another 140 walnut seedlings in 1993 as having the same soil characteristics as the original back 40. She did the planting herself, with the same planting bar her father had made from pipe and welded steel, which was by then 40 years old and had never needed repair. In 2002, Nadine's niece, a woman named Carla, who had grown up spending summers on the farm and who had inherited her great-uncle Elwood's habit of reading extension bulletins, moved back to Adair County and began learning the operation. She was 24 years old. Nadine spent 2 years walking every field with her, explaining the drainage maps and the soil maps and the timber inventory and the ledger system. She showed Carla the wooden crate of extension bulletins under the workbench, still organized by year, with Nadine's own additions going back to 1962. She showed her the folder of letters from Harold Sievert. She showed her the transit. Carla learned to use the transit in the fall of 2003, standing in the north field with Nadine behind her, adjusting the level bubble and reading the rod. She was 16 years into a profession she hadn't chosen and couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't grown up in a place like this. And she was learning it from a woman who had learned it from a man who had bought a surveyor's transit at a government Surma sale in 1951. Was worth more than almost anything else you could know about a piece of ground. Nadine spoke at a land management meeting in Kirksville in the spring of 2004 at the request of the county extension office. She was 73 years old. She stood at the front of a room with about 60 people in it and spoke without notes for 12 minutes. She said that the back 40 had cost her $82 to plant in 1963 and had returned $38,400 in a single selective harvest in 1991, not counting the callow production from the same ground over the same 28 years, and not counting the 240 acres of additional farmland she had been able to buy with cash because she had kept her costs low enough for long enough. That the money was there when the land came available. She said that people had laughed at her for planting trees in a pasture, and she understood why, because the return on the investment was not visible for 28 years, and most people could not hold a plan in their minds for 28 years. She said she had been able to hold it because her father had taught her to think in the same units of time the trees themselves used, and that this was the most valuable thing he had left her. More valuable than the farm and more valuable than the savings. She said that a paid-for farm and a paid-for timber stand are the only things a bank cannot take from you, and that everything else is just borrowing time. Roy Detweiler was in the room. He was 71 years old, and he had been farming the same ground east of Nadine's property since before she had planted the first walnut seedling. After the meeting, he found her near the door and told her that he had driven along her fence line in 1963 and again in 1968, and both times he had thought she was wrong. He said he had been thinking about it for 40 years, and he still was not sure he would have had the patience to do what she had done. Nadine said that patience was not quite the right word for it. She said it was more like arithmetic. She said that if you knew what the ground would produce, and you knew what the market would bear, and you did the multiplication across the time horizon, the answer was not a matter of patience. It was just a matter of reading the numbers correctly and then doing what the numbers said. What do you see when you look at a pasture? Most people see what it's producing. Right now, this year, this season, Nadine Pruitt saw what it could produce in the 41st year if you planted the right thing in the right ground and left it alone long enough to become what it was going to become. $82. A bare root order from a nursery in Columbia and a planting bar made from pipe, the back 40 that nobody wanted, planted by the woman nobody understood, until the ice came down and the veneer buyers drove the county roads and stopped their trucks at only one fence line in all of Adair County. That's the difference between someone who farms what they have and someone who builds what they need.